Unit 8, Lesson 2, Dark Faces of Power. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conflict Resolution and Peacemaking, the class that teaches you how to manage interpersonal conflict and drama for yourself and others. I'm your instructor, David Lowry. In our last lesson, we examined definitions and components of power. In this lesson, we will discuss some of the darker faces of power where people try to manipulate, control, or coerce others to do what they want. In a utopian world, there would be equality among all people. No one person would be able to use or abuse their abilities to force or compel others to do their will. There would only be two kinds of power, which allows each person the energy to do good works and others to work harmoniously to achieve outcomes that could only be obtained through cooperative efforts. However, in today's world, this is not the case. Power is often abused, and the differences between genders, economic status, age, education, social status, work abilities, and positions within hierarchies are often exploited. When differences arise, it is tempting for one to use their superior power within a system to shortcut the process of negotiation and relational communication by making decisions either by fiat or threat of coercion. It all begins with the balance of power. Symmetrical and asymmetrical power. When speaking about power, we often use the terms symmetrical and asymmetrical to describe the balance of potential between participants. In symmetrical relationships, individuals have equal amounts of power, which means neither can overly influence or coerce the other. In asymmetrical relationships, power is distributed unequally. When power is unequal, the dynamics of interpersonal relationships change as well. For instance, a parent has considerably more resources than children to enforce rules and conformity. They are physically larger, stronger, better educated, and have more financial resources. Of course, most would agree parents use their asymmetrical power appropriately, but in other situations, many individuals don't hesitate to use their control coercively. Problems greatly increase when inequities exist. It is here that opportunities for coercion and intimidation exist. For instance, sexual harassment, bullying, and workplace hostility are often tied to power differentials. The term power harassment has made its way into the legal lexicon and is used to describe abuses of authority by superiors over those who work for them, such as making demands that are impossible to meet, intruding on one's personal life, false evaluations, and the sort. Machiavellianism, the study of power and how one might use it, has been an eternal subject of interest. Around 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a book entitled The Prince. The book outlines his musings about what a fictional prince should do to gain and maintain power. Though fiction, it is based on centuries of received wisdom and insight about human nature and how to control others through fear and manipulation. It has been considered an ageless classic because of its provocative quotes and observations. Here are a few of them. It is much safer to be feared than loved. He who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command. If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared. He who seeks to deceive will find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. How we live is so different from how we ought to live that he who studies what ought to be done rather than what is done will learn the way to his downfall rather than his preservation. The vulgar crowd always is taken in by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. Even though Machiavelli said these and many other provocative things about power, he perceptibly admits there is another way of ruling, and that is through the power of love. Sadly, Niccolo did not pursue that avenue of authority and focused on advising the prince to maintain the appearance of being a loving ruler while resorting to methods of ruthlessness and fear. Robert Greene's 48 Laws. Even today, author Robert Greene has written a best-selling book entitled The 48 Laws of Power. Greene expands upon Machiavelli's observations. To be fair, many of his 48 laws are not based on deception and are very useful. Here are a few of the chapter titles found in his book. Never outshine the master, conceal your intentions, court attention at all cost, learn to keep people dependent on you, pose as a friend, work as a spy, keep others in suspended terror, and cultivate an air of unpredictability. It might be easy to conclude that Machiavellianism doesn't apply to the average person. After all, most people will not be ruthless dictators or significant political figures. However, a personal form of Machiavellianism impacts us all. Machiavellianism as a personality trait. Social science researchers Christian Geiss noted that many of the qualities described by Machiavelli's The Prince are observable in many of today's corporate and business leaders. They observed that many leaders have a relative lack of affect in interpersonal relationships, a lack of concern with conventional morality, a lack of gross psychopathology, and a lack of ideological commitment. Thus, the researchers were inspired to create a 20-question scale to measure one's interpersonal tendencies towards Machiavellianism. As a personality trait, Darling described Machiavellianism as one's propensity to distrust others, engage in amoral manipulation, seek control over others, and seek status for oneself. Here are some characteristics they found that describe Machs. They have contempt for conventional morals and ethics. As leaders, they are often directive, adaptable, and even charismatic, yet often unsupportive and inconsiderate of followers. Machs are concerned with maximizing their profits with little regard for their economic partners. Machs are more likely to take advantage and steal from others. Machs are strategic in the way they build political connections. Machs are usually dissatisfied with their jobs. Machs prefer legal and managerial positions instead of artistic and helping careers. Machs are less likely to help others. Many people justify their Machiavellian tendencies by saying, well, that's the way the world works. They say only a naive person could rule a large corporation or a substantial financial enterprise without resorting to these techniques. But no one should be naive. There are any number of individuals that readily embrace the manipulative tendencies of Machiavelli as a way of life. Luke's Three Faces of Power. Scholar and economist Stephen Lukes discusses how coercive power may be used to manipulate the large-scale agreement of the masses. Decision-making power. First, there is the open face of power most people easily recognize, where corporations and governments create policies and laws that have consequences for millions of people. This face of power will publicly present information designed to gain agreement and support, even though it will not necessarily be the focus of the final law. Hidden agendas. The second face of power is more hidden and subtle. The people holding this power shape agendas or things the media brings before us. The face of this power understands the importance of filtering the information decision makers receive, knowing that different decisions will be made based on the data and information they provide. Providing favorable information while omitting or limiting less flattering information leads people to draw a predetermined conclusion. People who shape these agendas are not always readily known and often operate in the shadows. Manipulation. The final form of power Luke discusses is the sinister face of manipulation. The goal is to shape public belief to harmonize with the wishes of a greater power. This is more commonly seen in forms of governmental propaganda. For instance, if the media is consistently portraying people as terrorists or religious extremists, it is much easier to shape decision-making, which may involve the use of military force. It's easier to pass laws restricting personal rights if people are prepared ahead of time to believe that it is necessary to relinquish these freedoms to fight some foe. Veto power. Though not included in Luke's Three Faces of Power, another form of manipulation, similar to his three faces, is the power that comes from exercising a veto. A veto player is someone whose agreement is necessary to approve any proposed change to the status quo. For instance, in U.S. politics, the president and state governors may veto any legislation they do not support. Vetoes are more common than you may think because they are also a factor in individual relationships. For instance, one person might sign a loan requiring two signatures if they get something in return. Parents can refuse to permit their children to do things. The ability to say no or block others from getting what they want is a potent form of power and control. Stanley Deetz, Managerialism. The last dark face of power we will discuss is Stanley Deetz's Managerialism, in which he outlines his critical theory of communication in organizations. Sometimes the abuse of power is blatant, and we can easily see the attempts at coercion. At other times, it's more hidden, insidious, and baked into systematic ways of living and working that we hardly notice. Deetz notes that many companies have balance sheets exceeding the gross national product of several democratic nations. The upshot of all this corporate growth and power is what Deetz calls corporate colonization, or the expansive creation of a new culture and set of expectations controlled by a corporate elite that impacts the decision-making structures of national governments, local communities, and individual life. Deetz describes how organizational structures and management systems have become de facto methods of corporate life impacting large swaths of the population. The way this is done is through communication and management style. Here are some of Stanley Deetz's observations. Companies view the communication process as little more than the distribution of information. They leave their employees out of discussion processes and pass along information and decisions made by leadership with the full expectations that employees will cooperate, support, and go along with them. Communication always favors the company view because communication is treated more like the company's socializing and propaganda arm. Company values are presented as ideals that all workers should aspire and subscribe to. The highest form of corporate authoritarianism is where managers tightly control all decisions and communication processes without input or explanation. Deetz also notes an organizational practice he calls consent. This is where management retains control over decision-making, but visits with employees about their ideas and concerns. It's a collusion approach to getting people to agree and conform to company rules and policies. Consent is much like the agreements people sign when they buy software or smartphones. The policies, which are extensively outlined, require your agreement to work. Involvement is another approach used by organizations. They solicit input from various constituent groups about policies, rules, and aspects of their work to make it appear that co-determination is taking place. However, in the end, any data collected from these groups is reassembled by a management team that decides how the new policies will work. Often these have little or no resemblance to the views which were given. This approach is consistently found in high schools and collegiate student government. Students are asked to convene their organizations and create a policy, only to learn that none of their views will be accepted or used by the educational leadership. Stanley Deetz's critical theory of organizations perceptively identifies the manipulation embedded in today's corporate structures that impacts every aspect of our lives. He notes that many people who live in democratic societies spend many hours every day working for corporations that are oppressively authoritarian. These large corporate structures impact our jobs, healthcare, investments, and the information we receive each day. Sadly, many, if not most, have become immune to the power differentials of daily existence and has sublimated them to the point where they consider them as another cultural norm. This lack of recognition can be a potent influence in conflicts between people where one person wields the inherent power of an organization against others who are feeling the pain of inequity by a system that values control more than people. These corporate attitudes and ways of thinking, which become a means of survival during the workday, can also bleed into interpersonal relationships of ordinary people as they attempt to use control and information processes rather than building relational approaches that strengthen and nurture bonds. Today, we have discussed some of the dark faces of power, beginning with Niccolo Machiavelli in the 1500s to today's omnipresent corporate managerialism. Then, as now, the goal of these dark faces of power is to coerce people into compliance using whatever means are available. We thank you for listening to today's podcast and encourage you to download a copy of this program's transcript so that you might better complete a short quiz over today's presentation.